I walked outside with my morning coffee, and there were 3 cars parked in my driveway. Not neighbors, not friends, strangers. At the end of my driveway was a bright orange sign that said, Community Overflow Parking, authorized by HOA. I hadn't voted on it. I hadn't agreed to it. And I definitely hadn't approved it. When I called the HOA president, she told me it was for the good of the community. That's when I decided, if they wanted to treat my driveway like public parking, I'd treat it like public parking too. And by the end of that day, the HOA learned a lesson they'll never forget. I still remember the exact sound my coffee mug made when it hit the concrete. It wasn't the fall that shocked me. It was what I saw beyond it. At the edge of my driveway stood a bright orange sign I had never seen before. It read, Community Overflow Parking, authorized by HOA. Underneath, in smaller print, thank you for supporting neighborhood unity. Neighborhood unity. 3 unfamiliar cars were already parked halfway up my driveway. A woman was unloading folding chairs from her trunk. A teenage boy was leaning against my garage door scrolling on his phone. One man even gave me a friendly nod like I'd personally invited him. For a split second, I honestly questioned myself. Had I missed a memo? A vote? Some email buried in spam? I walked to the property marker near the sidewalk and brushed dirt away with my shoe. The metal pin was exactly where it had always been. This was my land. My concrete. My driveway. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Fresh chalk lines had been drawn, dividing my driveway into neat parking spaces. Not random. Not accidental. Measured. This wasn't confusion. This was planned. And just as I was pulling out my phone to call the HOA president, another SUV turned into my driveway. Slowly. Confidently. As if this had always belonged to them. That's when I realized something far worse than a misunderstanding had happened. Someone hadn't just taken my driveway. They descheduled it. When I knocked on the HOA president's door, she answered almost immediately. Like she had been expecting me. Perfectly dressed. Perfectly calm. A clipboard already in her hand. Before I could even speak, she smiled and said, I assume you hear about the parking solution. Parking solution. That's what she called it. She stepped aside and motioned me in, laying several printed documents across her dining table like she was presenting a legal case. Highlighted sections, sticky notes, even tabs. She had prepared for this conversation long before I knew there was a problem. She pointed to a clause in the bylaws. The board may authorize temporary use adjustments of community accessible areas during approved events. Community accessible areas. I looked at her slowly. My driveway isn't community accessible. She didn't blink. It's visible from the main road. Not gated. And you don't have signage restricting entry. I almost laughed. That doesn't make it public. Her smile tightened just slightly. It makes it adaptable. Adaptable. That word hung in the air longer than it should have. Then she said something that made the room feel smaller. Well, technically, your lot sits on what used to be shared utility access. We reviewed old development maps. Old maps. I bought the house 2 years ago. The title was clear. Or at least I thought it was. As I stood there staring at her carefully organized paperwork, one unsettling thought crossed my mind. Had this been about parking at all? Or had she been waiting for a reason to test that boundary? If they wanted to treat my driveway like public parking, I decided I'd treat it like public parking too. But on my terms. That night, while the neighborhood slept, I got to work. I pulled out a measuring tape and carefully marked precise parking bays over the chalk lines they had drawn. I repainted them. Straighter. Sharper. Official looking. Then I installed a temporary metal sign at the entrance. Private property. Paid parking. $25 per hour. By entering, you agree to posted terms. Underneath, in smaller print, unauthorized parking subject to invoicing. It looked real. Intentionally real. By 8 a.m., the yard sale traffic had started again. Cars rolled in confidently. Just like the day before. A few drivers hesitated at the new sign. But after glancing toward the orange HOA sign still planted at the curb, they assumed it was all connected. By noon, my driveway was full. That's when I began phase 2. I walked out with a clipboard and a small handheld printer. Calm. Professional. I documented license plates, timestamps, photos. Then I placed neatly printed invoices on each windshield. No threats. No shouting. Just quiet paperwork. The reactions started about 30 minutes later. Confused knocks at my door. People waving printed slips in the air. Someone muttering, "This can't be legal." And then I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The orange HOA sign at the curb was gone. No announcement. No explanation. Just missing. And suddenly, all those parked cars weren't part of a community event anymore. They were trespassing. The meltdown didn't begin with shouting. It began with whispers. At first, it was small clusters of people standing near the end of my driveway, comparing invoices like students who just failed the same exam. Some looked annoyed, others nervous. A few were already dialing someone on their phones. Then she arrived. HOA Karen marched down the sidewalk like a storm in heels, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on despite the clouds rolling in. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't ask questions. She came straight for me. "You need to remove those immediately," she said, holding up one of my printed invoices. I kept my voice even. "Remove what?" "These fake parking charges." "Fake?" I tilted my head slightly. The sign clearly states terms of use. Her jaw tightened. "You can charge residents for parking at an HOA event. And you can authorize parking on private property." A small crowd had formed now. Phones were recording. The whispers had turned into murmurs. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You're recreating liability issues for the board." Liability. Interesting word choice. "Actually," I replied calmly, "the liability started when cars were directed onto property you don't own." That's when her composure cracked. She turned to the crowd and announced loudly, "Do not pay these. They're invalid." But just then, one of the residents spoke up. "Wait. If it's invalid, why did the HOA remove the parking sign?" Silence. Her head snapped toward the curb. The orange sign was gone. And for the first time all day, she looked unsure. By late afternoon, the yard sale tables were half packed, but the tension in the air hadn't faded. If anything, it had thickened. Neighbors weren't browsing anymore. They were watching. Watching me. Watching her. Watching the empty space where that bright orange HOA sign used to stand. I didn't say much after that moment. I didn't need to. Within an hour, a board member I'd never spoken to before quietly walked up my driveway. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He looked concerned. He asked if we could step aside and discuss a resolution. Resolution. That word felt very different from adaptable. He admitted the board had assumed I wouldn't object strongly. They believed labeling it temporary would prevent pushback. The old development map Karen mentioned, it had no legal standing, just outdated planning drafts from years ago. In other words, they gambled, and they lost. By sunset, I received a printed notice slipped under my door. It called the incident a miscommunication, and confirmed the driveway would no longer be referenced in HOA event planning. The bylaws, they said, would be clarified. The next morning, something else happened. A new neighborhood email went out reminding residents to respect private property boundaries. No mention of my name. No apology in bold letters. But everyone knew. Now when I back out of my driveway, it's empty, quiet, undisputed. And every time HOA Karen sees me, she doesn't wave anymore. She checks the ground first, as if making sure the boundary line is still there. If you enjoy HOA drama and satisfying neighborhood justice stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.